We've reached a point in the Great Reset where nobody can trust anyone in power anymore. And that includes the media. It includes all of the presidents, the leaders, and anything that comes from mainstream press. So when we hear that Russia is poised to invade Ukraine, what is one to believe? I know certainly I don't believe Joe Biden. I don't believe CNN. Putin, I would trust Putin more than those two outfits. But I don't trust Putin. Do I trust the president of the Ukraine, Zelensky? Probably more so than any mainstream media. And Zelensky is saying that there's no cause for alarm. This is rhetoric on the part of the United States. Undiplomatic was his word, undiplomatic rhetoric, which is hurting his markets. There is no cause for concern. So let's ask an expert, Salim Mansur, Professor Emeritus at the University of Western Ontario, what he believes is behind this rumor that Russia tomorrow, and that tomorrow could be any day, will invade the Ukraine much as they annexed Crimea after a referendum there. So Salim, your thoughts on this particular issue?
Hello, Robert. Your opening remarks is right on the money. There is absolutely no basis of trust on the mainstream media, what they're reporting, and there is no trust in the leadership in the Western democracies that we've gone through years of fake news, lies, and all sort of misinformation directed to push the fear on and shut down the society. So here we have now, in the midst of all of this, this crisis that has exploded upon the world, so to speak, or at least the Western democracies. I would put the word crisis in quotation mark. A crisis has exploded. That is the news that Russia, Vladimir Putin, is poised to invade Ukraine. That's the main line that is coming out of Washington. And as you have just pointed out correctly, only a couple of days ago, President Zelensky of Ukraine, after having spoken with on a phone call with President Biden, called a news conference with reporters in the capital, Kyiv, and there indicated that there is no such buildup and there is no such threat of Putin invasion of Ukraine, that they're monitoring the situation very closely. And here it is, the president of Ukraine, going soon after a conversation with the president of the United States, contradicting everything the president of the United States was telling him. The president is telling him that his country is about to be invaded by by Vladimir Putin's army that has been amassed on the borders. Now, who are we to believe, given that situation? Do we believe the president of the United States, or do we believe President Zelensky? Just further footnote on this matter. Yesterday, it was being reported by Washington media that the Russians have stockpiled a massive amount of blood supply in preparation for the invasion into Ukraine. And then soon after, the report was released in Washington. The CNN reporter from Ukraine, Kyiv, went on air with his buddies in Washington, the CNN Washington, and told them that this is all incorrect, that this is basically machination and fear mongering that is going on in Washington, that there is no such buildup, according to the Ukrainian reports. So there you have it again, a glaring contradiction. So the question, Robert, and this is a very important issue. I mean, whether there is going to be an invasion, whether this is all maneuver taking place by Vladimir Putin to test the resolve or the preparedness or the foreign policy of the Biden administration, given the record of the Biden administration over the past year and the shamble that the Biden administration has created, not only on the question of COVID-19 on the one side, but the economy is basically, on the mat. The supply chain is broken down. Inflation is going through the roof. And in the context of what we witness, the withdrawal of the United States forces from Afghanistan last summer in August of 2021, a precipitate withdrawal from Afghanistan that left behind not only the Afghan people who had for 20 years worked with the Americans in Afghanistan in trying to build up a new regime, a new administration, but the end result of that 20 years American presence in Afghanistan and over or approximately $3 trillion expenditure of US Treasury in Afghanistan. Biden administration walked away from Afghanistan, handed Afghanistan over back to the Taliban, along with something close to $90 billion of war equipment. So given that context, what is it now happening in Ukraine? Is this a real threat, or is this something that the deep state has basically cooked up to create a situation of a proxy war in Ukraine? And why?
What is
that's the burning question.
What about the fact that we're in the United States approaching midterm elections, I believe in November 8th, and as a run-up to any United States election, the Democrats typically throw some sort of diversion into the news stream to take away any attention that might be focused on the Democrat candidate, in this case Biden, or not Biden, he's not up for election, but the Democrats in the House and the Senate, and gubernatorial races as well. So could this be some sort of diversion on the part of the Biden administration, the usurper administration, to deflect from the dismal record of Joe Biden, considering he is polling perhaps the lowest poll numbers of any sitting president in history? What do you think?
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, that's where I was in a sense heading. That the question that we're asking has less to do with Ukraine and more to do with the United States, with the Biden administration, the Democratic Party, and the deep state. I would also suggest that Biden himself is not in control of anything in Washington. He is simply walking shadow of a man, whatever he was some years ago, and now basically dementia-ridden. He doesn't know what he's saying or what he's talking. In fact, in one of the press conference a few days or a week ago, Biden said that if there is a sort of a small incursion by the Russian into Ukraine, that would be okay, And then the State Department had to go full speed to reverse that remarks of Biden. So one can some way infer and not be too far off the mark that Biden doesn't have his hands on the lever. He's not the commander in chief. He's not the executive. He is the shadow president of the deep state in operation. And so it comes back to what it is happening in the United States rather than what's happening in Ukraine. What is happening in the United States is exactly as you said, the presidency and the vice president, both Biden and Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is polling even less than Biden, and she is somewhere in 20% approval or 20% support among the American electorate. And Biden is in the mid 30s, the lowest ever that has been recorded of a president in office. And the party, according to, if we go by independent polling results, that early polling that we are seeing, this still January, and we are headed into what will be basically the election year campaigning going on for the November election to the House of Representatives, congressmen, and senators. And if the polling results stand, as the early polling results are indicating, then the Democratic Party is facing a wipeout. There will be a takeover in the House by the Republican majority, and possibly the Senate also will revert back to a Republican majority. But here we must pause and make the distinction. Even if it comes back to the Republican majority, Republicans are also, like the conservatives in Canada, basically Republican in name only. I mean, there's a uniparty system in the United States that we have seen, that has been exposed during the Trump administration. So given all that is happening, this whole Ukrainian proxy war that is being pushed by the deep state is to muddy the water going into the election. That means that they will, with the mainstream media fully being the mouthpiece of the deep state and the Democratic Party, will be 24/7 talking about Russia, 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 the great devil, the Lucifer, out to take over, in a sense, Europe, and pushes interests deep into where American interests and Russian interests collide. And any of the Republican candidates that questions the deep state maneuvering that is taking place politically on the Ukraine story will then be represented, will be smeared, will be put by the mainstream media as being weak and as being engaged in a collusion with Russia, which was the narrative that they had created for Trump. It was Russia, Russia, Russia all the way. And then there was the two impeachment trial that took place with Trump. Trump's hand was tied entirely during the 4 years with the special counsel Bob Mueller investigating into the Steele dossier and the Russian collusion story. So that I think I can infer that is what is happening behind all of the noise that has been generated about Ukraine, and Russia is about ready to pounce upon Ukraine. And what we are hearing, not only from the president of Ukraine, which we just talked about, but we are also hearing from the European member states of NATO and the EU. So if we put all of this into context, and let's do that, because there is that American side, we've talked about it, but let's look at the Ukraine, Russia situation and Europe. One of the main questions that was posed to the White House during a press conference last week was, if the European member states of NATO has failed to live up to their commitment to NATO of providing 2% of the GDP for NATO defense needs, security needs in Europe. NATO is a European alliance. Its main theater of operation is basically Europe. NATO was created after Second World War in the late 1940s, early 1950, to hold the Soviet army in Eastern Europe from advancing into Western Europe. And the battle line was cut right through the heart of Europe, heart of Germany, East Germany, West Germany, and so on. So on one side was NATO, led by the United States as a leading member of the NATO alliance, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We, Canada, are a member of it, and other European states such as Britain, Germany, and Holland, and so on. And on the other side, the NATO was facing the Warsaw Pact country, the armies of the Soviet Union-led alliance, Warsaw Pact. Well, Soviet Union no longer exists. That Soviet Union dissolved more than 30 years ago, 1991, 1992, Soviet Union dissolved. And here you have NATO, a defense treaty that was against the Soviet Union. The question is, what is the NATO standing for today? Well, let's leave that to the heads of the European government and to the United States and to Canada. But the question that was asked is, when the NATO members are not living up to their defense agreement, the commitment, then what is there for the United States to be involved in this matter of Ukraine? And there is no answer to that. You look at Germany. Germany has not stepped up to the plate. Germany has not raised any alarm over the Ukraine issue. You look at France, and the French are not talking about Ukraine. What they're talking about is taking, if this is a real crisis, then taking the Ukraine issue to further tighten and build up the European defense system. France is not talking about NATO. The only country that has made the shrill noise about NATO is Great Britain, which was expected. And the other one is Canada, which also is expected. So when you have the main European member states of NATO, particularly Germany, and along with Germany, all the other member states of Europe that are closely tied up with Germany, because Germany is the leader of the European Union, both financially and politically, then the question emerges, what is the Ukrainian crisis? Okay, so we pause there. There is the whole relationship of Germany and the European Union with Russia that needs to be understood, that needs to be explored. This is a bitterly cold both in Europe and in North America. The Europeans are immensely dependent upon energy needs imported from, in this case, Russia. The Nord Stream gas pipeline is the main pipeline among, and there's an older pipeline that is supplying oil and gas to Germany. Germany has not stepped forward and said that they are going to stop bringing in gas and oil from Russia. And gas and oil is basically the principal revenue source for the Russian economy. Now, would Vladimir Putin jeopardize their principal revenue source? It is estimated that oil and gas is now over a third of Russian revenue that comes from exporting Russian fuel supply. So that's one dimension of it, a very important dimension. It's not only Germany, but there are other European states that are that require that supply line to remain open, and that they are bringing in their energy need from Russia. And then you have the other situation. The Russians and the Ukrainians, by the way, they know, because they have been the ones who have been playing the pay-to-play politics with the Democratic Party. They know that Biden and his son, Hunter Biden, has been at the receiving end of large amount of money that has passed from Ukrainian agents and Russian agents to Biden, to his son Hunter Biden, which has not been investigated by the American deep state at all. The Ukrainians, for instance, they had Hunter Biden, they put Hunter Biden on the payroll of Burisma, which is one of the main Ukrainian energy company. Hunter Biden has no experience, no background in energy business. And yet he was made a member of the board of directors of Burisma at $80,000 a month, if I recall correctly. And that was clearly a pay-to-play scheme in which...
Not only that, Salim, don't, well, you can recall, I know you can, but just for our viewers and listeners, Biden, Joe Biden, when he was vice president, interfered in the internal investigation of Burisma by threatening the Ukrainian government to remove the prosecutor, the head prosecutor. Unless they removed him, he wouldn't give him $1 billion loan. That's when he was vice president. And he laughed about it at a Council on Foreign Relations video that's still out there. So not only do we have the corruption, the financial corruption of the Hunter Biden, Joe Biden, because Joe Biden had a cut of that, we all know, but there was the interference into the internal policing of that corruption by Joe Biden himself. So this is quite a quagmire, quite a mess. I wanted to ask you another facet of this issue, and that is that people are saying when we encourage the Ukraine to join NATO, that is only exacerbating the situation because Russia doesn't want more NATO countries on their frontier. And they're likening it to, for example, Khrushchev and the Bay of Pigs, or Khrushchev and the blockade of Cuba, because the Soviet Union, the communist empire, the Russian hegemony, tried to put nuclear weapons in Cuba. The United States said, no way, that's not happening. That's the straw that's breaking this camel's back. We're not going to let it happen. And people say that perhaps this is like that. And I say two things. First of all, Russia is not the Soviet Union anymore. Sure, it's not a nation that has to be trusted. It's a corrupt nation, and Putin is a corrupt man. However, from what I see, they don't have designs on empire anymore. And secondly, there's a number of NATO countries, former Soviet bloc, Eastern Bloc countries, which are now part of NATO, right on the frontier with Russia, and that doesn't seem to be a problem. You've got Czech Republic and Croatia and Lithuania and Latvia and Poland, all NATO countries now. Russia didn't invade, Russia didn't budge, Russia didn't say anything, so why should they do that now over the Ukraine? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to get into again the geography and the history of that part of the world, and so Ukraine, Russia, and then Europe. What used to be Western Europe, now Europe itself, but Europe is now divided. Germany got united, and now we have Europe, right? We need to talk a little bit about that, but I just want to complete the point that you have the head of the government, the chief executive, the president of the United States, who has been on the receiving end of pay-to-play scheme by the Ukrainians, and that's what I was pointing out, Burisma story that was never investigated in the run-up to the 2020 election. And on the Russian side is the same thing. I mean, the richest woman in Russia, the widow of the mayor of Moscow, the name of the man, it escapes me right now. His name was Yuri something, but his wife, Elena Buterina, the widow, paid Hunter Biden $3.5 million dollar to Hunter Biden a few years ago. So we need to keep in mind that network of relationship, the level of corruption that is there in Washington. So now by the way, let me make one further point on that, and I swing to what you have asked. In the lead up to the 2020 election, it was not only about Ukraine and Russia, who were paying Biden through their son a lot of money, as they had done with Hillary and Bill Clinton. I mean, there's a story about the Bill Clinton Foundation. Clinton Foundation was money had flown from Russia. I mean, the Uranium One story, where Hillary Clinton, as a Secretary of State, was responsible in the decision making of selling Uranium One mines to Russia during that period of time. And then it's on public record, Bill Clinton being invited to speak in Moscow for a 20-minute or a half an hour speech, being paid by Putin $500,000. So those are the record we have of these decision makers on the one side, and the story is similar on the Chinese side, but the Chinese have invested money into the Biden family. And this story was brought out by Tony Bobulinski just ahead of the November 2020 election. He went public. Tony Bobulinski is the CEO of an investment company called Sino-Hawk. Tony himself was a former US Navy lieutenant. After serving in the US Navy, he retired and went into business. He set up this company in which Hunter Biden was brought in, again, to represent Joe Biden, who was at that time the vice president in the Obama administration, and something $1 billion was transacted between the Chinese and through Bobulinski for the Biden family. So that's the context. Both sides, China and Russia, and in this case, Ukraine, have all invested heavily into the personal wealth of the Biden family. So now we back up and look at the larger picture of the geography and history of Ukraine and Europe. Now, Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, 1992. The former republics of the Soviet Union emerged as independent states, from Kazakhstan to Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, as you have now mentioned, including Belarusia, Moldova, and of course, Ukraine. The concern of the Americans at that time, President George Herbert Walker Bush was the president. In 1991, 1992, he lost the election in November of 1992 to Bill Clinton. The primary concern in Washington at that time was to get the nuclear weapons of the former Soviet Union that was deployed in many of these former Soviet republics for these states to give them. And for the Ukraine, that was a major issue, because Ukraine had or deployed, Soviet had deployed in Ukraine something like 2,000, between 1,900 and 2,000 strategic nuclear warheads. And the concern of the Bush administration and the incoming Bill Clinton administration was to persuade Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapon, and in return, they would negotiate an arrangement to provide for the security of Ukraine. So the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, signed by United States, United Kingdom, and Russia was done to guarantee the security of Ukraine. And with that guarantee, Ukraine gave up its nuclear stockpile of strategic nuclear warheads. Okay, so that was in 1994. And a lot of things happened. But here, one critical point is that at that time, during the Bill Clinton administration, Ukraine was not offered a membership in NATO, as happened subsequently with Poland, Hungary, and the other Baltic states. It is an interesting thing that Ukraine was not invited into the NATO, and the point is, Russia possibly would not have signed on to the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 if that had been one of the conditions on the table. We must remember the 1990s, the concern was nuclear proliferation into many of the third world countries. I mean, there was the whole issue of Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, so on and so forth. So that concern overrid every other concern on the question of Ukraine and NATO at that point in time. Now, moving on forward, it was understood that Russia would be not only not pleased, but would have great objection and would try to stop any agreement that would make Ukraine a member of NATO, and that consideration, it seems, has played out. Ukraine is not a member of NATO as we are speaking right now. It is not even an associate member, and so the whole issue that NATO will become involved, as our former foreign minister, Chrystia Freeland, has said recently, this is about democracy, this is about sovereignty, and we are going to stand tall. That is, Canada is going to stand tall as a member of NATO in defending Ukraine against a Russian invasion if that happens. So the point is, as many people are asking in America, is, in what will America involve? What is America's national interest at stake over here on this whole issue that has now arisen in a manner that the deep state has presented itself? The Germans are not talking about a NATO issue. Other European states are not talking about a NATO issue. It is only the United States and Canada. So it is in this context, you're absolutely right. No, well, I mean, the situation is very, very critical in the sense of what the Americans are talking about. If what we're hearing from President Zelensky, that the situation is not as dire as what the Americans are making out to be, then the fear is that if there is a false flag operation, this can turn explosive. And then we don't know what the unintended consequences will be.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll leave it there, Salim, and watch this unfold. If it unfolds, who knows? It could be a Ukraine nothing burger, an election year diversion, a blip on the mainstream media to take people's attention away from Biden's failing so-called presidency. But I appreciate your insight and your opinion. Thank you, Salim.